Welcome back to Quarantine Engineering. In the previous video, I showed how we set up our solder mask and used other pieces of PCB to form our mold. And now in this video, I'll show you actually how to apply the solder paste. First thing I'm going to do is I'll drop a new PCB in there. You see it fits very nicely. And of course, then I can double check and make sure everything lines up. Good. Now, excuse me, this cough, again, old cough I've had, I wish would go away. So a few things we want to do before, because once you start working with solder paste, you have working life. And the first thing you should do, of course, is review your solder paste. So this is a particular solder paste I like to use from Quick Chip. It is their lead-free version, the TS3915NL. And the first thing you should do, of course, when working with ME chemicals or any materials, is you should read their safety data sheet, their SDS, which is provided on the website, as well as you should look at their manufacturer's instructions. And in those manufacturer's instructions, you'll see it has a big stop, read the instructions. And so you can see it describes how to use the product. And so, of course, then you should do that, right? Push the rubber under the plunger, make sure the orange screw cap, prevent dispensing, push the plunger in its syringe until it's fully in the back, blah, blah. And then on what you'll also see in one of these is then they have their reflow profiles. So if you look, these are the temperature profiles it recommends for these materials to solder. And so what you typically see, and it's more complicated, if we had a machine that could do this, you typically have this ramping profile. And what they do is they first warm it up and then they soak it for a while. And why they do that is to let any water vapor evolve off the surface and let the flux start working. And then what they do is once they do that, then they ramp it up to the melting point of the solder. And they only hold it there for a few seconds and then they rapidly cool. So this is what you would program into a more advanced tool. If you had a lot of heat sources, you could, for example, have something sitting here, you know, about 160 C. You could place it there for a few minutes and then you could put it into a hotter surface at the time. However, for a lot of things you may be able to get away with just skipping it and you just put it in and you let it warm up. Which is what I'll do today because I don't have quite the temperature control. But it's before you proceed, it's good to make sure you know your materials and make sure you have everything. Another thing you should do is you should inventory all of your parts that you got from DigiKey, Mouser, and all the other sources to make sure you have everything you need, because you may not. And one thing you may also want to look into is some manufacturers often they may not have what the part is clearly labeled in a way that makes sense on their packaging, and so you may want to go through and you may want to check and make sure you can label that this is a 1 microfarad capacitor, this is a 10 microfarad capacitor, etc. Do that in advance. And another thing I like to do before I proceed, if you have a complicated board like this one today, is I print out a large copy of the layout. And this is a little bit, there we go, focused. And then I label what each of these pieces are. And if something has a direction, I make sure it's labeled where my first pin is. So like you see here, here's pin 1 and here's the dot. I make sure it's all very labeled very clearly. And I actually made multiple copies of this. And as I do each board, then I'll cross off each part. That way I keep track of it. Another thing that becomes very helpful that I didn't do here is oftentimes we have a lot of one part. So for example, on this board we have several 100 nanofarad capacitors. What I'll often do is I'll make a tally on a piece of paper, say, oh, I have 6 100 nanofarad capacitors on the board. Because when you start putting on your pieces, you're going to open a bag of 100 nanofarad capacitors. Well, you want to make sure you place all of them on the board and don't miss one before you move on to the next batch of parts. So kind of doing your housekeeping so you can keep track of it is important. And so once you have, you have all your parts and you're ready to go, you should be good. Now for this particular solder paste, they give you a working life of several hours. So that means we have several hours at room temperature to place our paste, to place our parts, and to do the soldering. Now, if you extend your working beyond that time, the paste may not work properly. So that's kind of all the stuff you need to get ready. And so what we have now, again, is we have our board here. It's lined up, and I use painter's tape in this case to line it up. And I use extra PCBs so that way it stays flat, because if you have a board that's weird shapes, you don't want this to bend as you're applying pressure. The other thing I need now to put the paste down is I need some flat edge to scrape the paste in. And you can use like a credit card or anything with like a sharp edge. I often have a lot of extra PCBs laying around, like this little one. So I'm going to use the edge of this, and I can then use it to scrape it in. Where what I'll do as I do this is, because this bows a little bit, so if I lift up, you see it changes color on the screen. It's a little bit curved, so I want to make sure I hold it down so it's touching the surface, especially for these high density pads, and then I can scrape carefully all my solder paste across it before I let my fingers up. So I'm kind of just practicing now with my fingers of where I want to hold them to keep good pressure. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to squirt, and I'm going to use too much because I don't make a lot, so it's not the most efficient process, but I'm going to take a cap off here, and I've prepared this per the manufacturer's instructions, so I can hold everything down like that. And now I can go in and I can start applying paste. So first I'm just going to apply some paste kind of over some of my high density pads. This is way too much paste. You'll find there's lots left over when we're done, but it kind of squeezes out there. But we're prototyping, so I'm more just interested in getting one working than doing that. Now if I'm doing more than one board, I can use the extra paste on the next board to start. So what I'm going to do now is I want you to scrape in the paste and fill in all the holes. Just like this. You see there's lots of extra paste still. I was very liberal in my paste application in this case, and so I'm going to scrape that off over here where hopefully I can reuse it. So what I'm going to do now after I get everything down, so I don't want too thick, so I'm going to scrape real nice and go just like that, and I want to double check and make sure it's filled in. So you see there's some spaces I miss, and I go back in. I'm carefully doing it. I'm still applying firm pressure with my hands to make sure that. So then let's see a little more paste down here. So a little bit more in this one. So when I'm done, I should look and I should see that it seems like the paste is filled in all the openings to the surface, but not above. There's that. So at that point then I can lift up my fingers up carefully and then quickly lift this up. And I don't want to slide it around because it could distort my small pads. And now I have the solder paste applied. And what I want to do is then I want to inspect that usually. And how I can do that is I can look at the fine pitch and see if they've bled together. And if they have, there's ways to resolve that. But at this point, this is water-soluble solder flux. I could always just wash it off and try again. Another thing you may want to do is, this is your first time getting everything working, is once you put the solder paste, don't put a lot of components on if you don't have extras, or if it's a complicated board. Take one of your boards and run it through the soldering process and see how it works. Make sure the solder paste works. This is also good if you haven't used the solder paste in a long time to make sure it hasn't expired. And make sure you get shiny, happy solder, and you know the temperature is good. And then you can come back and put one with parts. So I've done that previously, and all we'll do to test that is we'll just put it in the oven and we'll watch until the solder starts melting and getting shiny and solder-like. So there's one. And just to show you then, I'm going to do a second board right now, because I'm going to make a couple here. So then to make the next board, I just drop in the next one, double check, it lines up, which is real nice. You see that's where that hinge makes life really convenient. And I can already kind of put down my solder paste. I got my fingers. And this is why I like working with, and you can also wear gloves, and if you have some, I would recommend it. Just keep your hands clean. This is lead-free, luckily, but you don't want to work with stuff here. So we're just gonna put this down. Usually don't get up my hands, so that's a unique situation. And when I'm done doing this, I can go, and again, it's dry and it's water soluble, so I'm able to then remove any extra solder. paste I don't need. So now I've, again, coated here like that. Now I can lift it up and remove it. And one thing you can note is when you're doing this is you may not want to get solder down. So I put a piece of paper between goes if I'm letting it sit. Right, so now I've got a second board, just like that. And then my piece of paper I set right here. So now I can come in, and you can see I still got lots of solder paste, so I used way too much at the beginning. But just to show you going quick and prototyping, I still have a lot of solder paste here for my application. If this was, of course, you know, trying to do volume manufacturing, someone will be cringy. But if we're doing that, there's some equipment we can invest in for fairly low cost to do this more efficiently. But hopefully this has been showing you how we quickly can put solder paste using a solder mask on my hand, where all we need is our circuit boards, a piece of cardboard, and some tape. And so thank you, and I'll see you in the next episode.